Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to wait while a number of people join the webinar. So if you just bear with us for a moment, we'll start in a minute or so. Thanks very much. Good afternoon. I'll start the process. I think there's still a few more people who are joining, but I think the vast majority are online. So thank you very much again to all those who've joined us this afternoon. This is a Make UK webinar looking at the obligations for companies and manufacturers in particular, and the introduction of the UK Conformity Assessment Mark, the UKCA. I'm delighted to be joined on the call this afternoon by colleagues from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and by my colleague Chris Newson, who are going to take you through some of the issues and some of the changes which are taking place. I think at the top of this meeting, just to say that we do have the opportunity for members to ask questions. You can put questions either in the Q&A box or in the chat box. So please do put your questions throughout the presentations, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. My name is Fergus McReynolds. I'm the Director of EU and International Affairs for Make UK and work in Brussels on our international and EU portfolios, and also throughout the process of the UK leaving the EU, looking at our new relationship with Europe and the new obligations that companies need to undertake in terms of that changed relationship. I'll hand over in a moment to colleagues from the business department, Laura, Ben and Chris, who are online, and they'll take you through some of the changes which companies need to be ready for. But I would at this point like to acknowledge the work that we have done collectively with BEIS and the ministerial teams, and understanding the impact that the changes are likely to have, and particularly the pressure that was being seen through international supply chains, and understand that the government, and welcome the fact that the government have brought forward a longer transition period or easement period, so that the recognition of CE marking will continue in the Great Britain market until the end of next year, as opposed to the end of this year. So that's very much a welcome easement. That doesn't mean that the pressure is off for us to be ready for implementing the UKCA fully. So we're delighted that we are continuing that conversation with the business department, and taking this opportunity to use the next 18 months to make sure that companies are ready for the obligations for the market. After the presentation from BEIS, I'll turn to my colleague Chris, who'll take you through some of the more specific issues around the manufacturing sector, and highlighting some of the ways in which Make UK can help companies with their obligations, both for the UKCA and for the CE marking on the Europe market. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Laura from BEIS. So thank you very much.
Many thanks, Fergus. So I'm just going to share my screen to show you the presentation. So just bear with me as I pull that up. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So I'm just going to start the presentation as well. Great. So as Fergus obviously mentioned, we are here from the Department for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy. So my name is Laura Bedford, and I'm joined by my colleagues Benedict Luccan and Chris Smart. But I think Chris might be having some trouble joining. But we work in the team that is responsible for implementing the new UKCA marking and the new domestic regime for goods in Great Britain. And obviously, of course, looking after Northern Ireland as well. Obviously, there are slightly different rules there, which we'll talk about in the presentation. So I'll just kind of get going. So what I'll be doing with this presentation is it's just kind of summarising, of course, what you need to do to kind of place manufactured goods on the market in Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and really focusing on kind of the key actions that you need to take. So we'll be covering kind of when you need to start using the UKCA marking, and Fergus has already, of course, alluded to the extension that we have put in place now. How to place products on the Great British market, the rules and obligations of different economic operators, so importers, distributors, manufacturers, and so on, and of course also placing goods on the market in Northern Ireland as well. Oh gosh, sorry, I think I've skipped 2 slides there. So I'll start with talking about the transition to the UKCA marking and the new timeline for its adoption. So, of course, the UKCA marking is the new product marking for the Great British market. It applies to England, Scotland and Wales, and of course will apply to all goods which previously required the CE marking or the reverse epsilon marking. So, as I mentioned already, there are different rules in place for Northern Ireland, which will be covered later in the presentation. So since the 1st of January 2021, so this year, the essential requirements and standards that can be used to demonstrate compliance are still the same, and all harmonised standards became designated standards. So there are, of course, there are changes you need to make, but it is really important to remember the essential requirements and standards are the same. So the changes aren't, so great and therefore not so difficult to do. So generally, if you self-declared before for using the UKCA marking, you can do the same with CE marking, and the same principle applies on if you need to have your product tested by a third party. It's generally the same for the UKCA as for the CE. It's also really important to remember that you can place the UKCA and CE markings on the same product if it's destined for both the EU and GB markets, as long as it meets the rules. And of course, I don't just mean kind of the essential technical requirements, but the rules for kind of displaying both markings on the product. Well, I'll touch on this again a little bit later on. And it's also just important to note that the responsible authority for enforcement has not changed, and that kind of remains UK trading standards, who will continue to kind of operate the same kind of market surveillance as they did before. So just to talk about that really important key change that we've made very recently, you do now have until the 1st of January 2023 to adopt the UKCA marking. And I think, as Fergus alluded to, this really was done in response to feedback from industry. We are aware that businesses continue to face challenges from the pandemic, which has made it more difficult to adapt. And our priority is to be supportive, and which is why we've introduced the extension. So we'll be introducing legislation later on this year to allow that additional year to adopt the UKCA marking, and during the next 12 months, well, I guess now still 14 months from now, approximately, you can still place manufactured goods on the GB market with the CE marking. As Fergus mentioned, however, this isn't time to kind of sit back. We would encourage you to make sure you're ready to use the UKCA marking as soon as possible. As from the 1st of January 2023, it will become a legal requirement to place a product on the market in Great Britain. So this is really the final deadline. There will be no further extension. And I think it's really important, as I said, to take action as soon as you can. It's not on this slide, however, we are also extending the period during which you can apply the UKCA marking with a sticky label or an accompanying document, so that there's another 12 months for that. But there are some exceptions to some product sectors. And just to say as well, we recognise this extra time isn't just for industry to kind of take the actions that they need to. There's also some work to do on our side. So we'll continue to kind of run webinars and support events such as these for industry and for businesses. to make sure you've got the information that you need, but we're also going to be working to support conformity assessment bodies and increase capacity in areas where we know there is less of it. So that's really kind of where we're focusing our attention as well over the next 14 to 15 months. So just to kind of emphasize those key dates, of course, you can use the UKCA marking now, but you can, of course, still continue to place CE marked goods on the market while you're preparing to use the UKCA marking. So you've got until the 31st of December 2022 to kind of make your preparations and be ready to apply the UKCA. Then, of course, from the 1st of January 2023, you must use the UKCA marking when placing most goods on the market in Great Britain. And as I said, you've got until the 31st of December 2023 for that's how long you can still apply the UKCA marking via a sticky label or an accompanying document on most goods. So the exceptions are listed on gov.uk, but I think they are construction products, marine equipment, transportable pressure equipment, rail products, medical devices. I think that's all of them, but it's good to check gov.uk. And then from the 1st of January 2024, you must apply the UKCA marking directly to the product unless the legislation allows otherwise. So there are some exceptions, for example, very small products and so on. And then just say, of course, medical devices is different as it says on the slide. So you would have until the 1st of July 2023 to apply the UKCA marking to those products. But I suspect that is less relevant to this audience. So again, we'd encourage you to kind of make sure you're starting this process as soon as possible, just because it does take a while, particularly if you're using third-party testing, to make these changes. So I'm now going to talk a bit about how to use the UKCA marking and how to go about placing your products on the market in Great Britain. So this slide kind of sets out a very high level, really, the process that you need to follow to get the UKCA marking onto your goods and onto the Great British market. So of course, once you've established that you need to use the UKCA marking, you will need to check the right route for conformity assessment. As I mentioned kind of at the beginning, you probably already know, if you've already been placing CE marked goods on the market in Great Britain, what you need to do in that respect. But of course, now you'll need to use a UK conformity assessment body to get your products tested if that's what's needed, or you'll need to follow the process for self-assessment, and there's obviously a process affiliated with that. So then, of course, the next step is making sure you draw up the appropriate technical documentation. So if you self-declare, of course, you must keep this documentation, which demonstrates that your product conforms with the regulatory requirements as set out in UK law. And you should, of course, keep that in the form of a technical file or document. And of course, rules about what you need, documentation you need as well for if it's a third-party tested product. But I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. Then, of course, once you've got your documentation ready, you'll need to apply the UKCA marking to your product. So ensuring that it's correctly marked and placed, and the UKCA marking kind of meets the rules around kind of placing and size and so on. And again, I'll talk about the general rules for this a bit more in a second. And then once you've done all those things, you can place your product on the market. But it's really important to check that you understand the definition of placing on the market. Again, I'll talk about this more in a second. But this is quite important in the context of when you need to apply the UKCA and when you can still kind of have the CE marked goods being placed on the market. So, of course, if you use self-declaration, this slide is definitively less relevant to you, but I've already talked a little bit about that, and you should know hopefully you know what you're doing. But some products, of course, do require mandatory third-party conformity assessment where the legislation requires external testing and not just voluntary testing, where manufacturers prefer to have somebody else check that the product is compliant and then self-declare. So that's the difference there. And just to be absolutely clear, of course, there is no mutual recognition agreement between the European Union and the United Kingdom. So that means that you can no longer use EU notified bodies to test for the UK market. But of course, they can still certify for the Northern Ireland market. But we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So in the UK, of course, we do now call notified bodies approved bodies, and this means that they can test for the UKCA marking for the Great British market. They cannot test, of course, for the CE marking for the EU market, but they can and are still considered notified bodies for the purposes of the Northern Ireland market, where EU rules still apply. And again, we'll talk about that later on. You can find a list of all kind of UK bodies on the UK MCAB database, which is on gov.uk. So you can kind of search, I think, for your sector and the kind of regulations that you need testing done for. So you do need to make sure you have separate certificates in place for the GB and EU markets. And as always, we would encourage you to speak to your conformity assessment body as soon as possible, if you haven't already, to understand what your options are in terms of arranging conformity assessment for the UK and EU markets where needed. So for businesses, it's important to note that under the terms of the withdrawal agreement, upon request by a manufacturer, a conformity assessment body located in the UK or EU should share with a body located in the other market information they hold in relation to conformity assessments carried out before the end of the transition period. So of course, it ended on 31st December 2020. So this is intended to kind of facilitate the issuing of new certificates through the sharing of information. And we do get some questions on this. I mean, there is, I think, no kind of legal obligation for bodies to do this. It is kind of up to their discretion, which is why it's really important to have that conversation with them about how they can provide your certification. So just to talk a little bit more about documentation, of course, you need to keep documentation to demonstrate that your product conforms with the appropriate regulatory requirements. And of course, if market surveillance authorities are checking up on this, they can request this information at any time to check that your product conforms. So it's very important to have this information to hand and ready to go in case that information is requested. And it's really important to note too, of course, that the information you keep depends on the specific product legislation, but also on which economic operator you are in the supply chain. So of course, there are different obligations if you're an importer, which we'll cover later on. But as a general, these are kind of some general principles stated on this slide. So of course, making sure you have general records in the form of a technical file. So this tends to be information like how the product is designed and manufactured, how it's been, how the product has been shown to conform with the relevant requirements, and the address of the manufacturer, as well as any kind of storage facilities. Then to talk a bit about the UK Declaration of Conformity, as it says on the slide, it is very similar to the EU Declaration of Conformity. So it should just declare the product conforms with the relevant statutory requirements, have the name of the manufacturer and the address or the authorised representative alongside information about the product and the conformity assessment body, if relevant. The information required, of course, depends on the specific product legislation. But generally, it will need information like the product serial number or type identification. You will need to list kind of the relevant legislation that applies to the product, your name, of course, and signature, and you'll need to declare that you take responsibility for the product's compliance and so on. So again, it is very similar to what you have done previously for an EU Declaration of Conformity. So in terms of kind of applying the UKCA marking, in most cases, of course, you must apply the UKCA marking to the product itself or to the packaging. But again, it varies depending on the specific regulations that apply to the product. So it's super important to check these and follow kind of the specific regulations that apply to your product. So in terms of general rules, there's more information about this on gov.uk, but the general rules include things like, ensuring the marking is proportion to the version that's set out to gov.uk. So if you change the size, depending on what your product is, it must be in proportion to the version set out on gov.uk. That it's at least 5 millimeters in height, unless there's a different minimum, minimum height even set out in the legislation. And of course, it must be clearly visible and legible to not being obscured by other markings or labels. Again, we have introduced this easement, which is in place until the end of 2023. So this means that you can apply the UKCA marking via a sticky label or an accompanying document for most products. And after this, it must be on the product unless your specific product regulation allows for an alternative. So there are cases where you can still apply it to to a label or to an accompanying document, for example, for products that are very small. But again, this is stated in the specific legislation. So before you continue to do that, after next year, you should check the legislation and make sure you can continue to do so. So to talk a bit about like placing goods on the market, our current definition is stated on the slide, so I'll just read that out. So a fully manufactured good is placed on the market when a written or verbal agreement or offer or of an agreement to transfer ownership or possession or other property rights in the product is exchanged. So really important to note that this refers to each individual good and not a type of good. And in terms of kind of proving this, you can prove this through kind of regular business documents. So contracts of sale, invoices, documents concerning the shipping or shipping of the goods for distribution. And in terms of kind of what this means in kind of practical terms, if you've placed a good on the GB market before the end of 2022, it does not require the UKCA marking, of course, but it does require the CE marking, and it can continue to circulate until it's reached its end user. But if you place a good on the market from the 1st of January 2023, it will need the UKCA marking, regardless of kind of when it was manufactured or something like that. So it's really important to understand and make sure you know whether your goods have been placed on the market or not, because that kind of has an impact, of course, on what marking you might need to use. So I'm just going to go through two kind of examples. So if a GB-based toy manufacturer contracts to supply individually identifiable and fully manufactured toys to a shop before the 31st of December 2022, this agreement does constitute placing on the market, even if the toys are physically delivered after the 31st of December 2022. So that's for goods manufactured in Great Britain. So and then an example for kind of goods manufactured outside of Great Britain. So if you were an overseas electronics manufacturer and you agreed to sell individually identifiable and fully manufactured goods to Great Britain to an end user, that would also constitute placing on the market, and you would have that proof, and that would be kind of placed on the market. So that could still be a CE marked goods if that was done before the end of 2022. And then just talk about a different example. So this is an example of repaired and refurbished goods. So if a customer sends a piece of equipment operated by a tablet, so computer, back to the manufacturer for repair or refurbishment, if either the equipment or tablet are repaired without changing their original performance, purpose, or type, then there would be no need to retest or remark when returning that to the customer. But for example, if the faulty tablet is replaced with a new tablet, then the new tablet, as a spare part, essentially will need to meet GB rules, and therefore would require UKCA marking if it's being placed on the GB market for the first time after the 31st December 2022. So that's just an example of a specific case, and I hope that's kind of helpful. But do feel free to ask some more questions about this in the chat if you would like. So I'm now just going to talk a little bit about economic operators, so roles and responsibilities. So there's kind of four key different economic operators that we kind of talk about when it comes to manufactured goods regulation. So you've got the manufacturer, the importer, the distributor, and authorized representatives. So if you're a manufacturer, you are somebody who manufactures a product or has a product designed or manufactured and markets that product under its name or trademark. You're an importer if you're the first person to place goods on the Great British market from an external market, which of course now includes the EU market. And it's really important to note that the importer definition for goods varies from the definition for customs. So the customs definition is a bit broader. So an importer can either be the owner of the goods being imported or anyone that has a beneficial interest in the goods being imported. Whereas for the purposes of goods regulation and placing goods on the market, an importer is anyone who brings a third country product into the UK and supplies it on the GB market. Then, of course, we've got distributors. So a distributor is a person other than the manufacturer or importer who makes goods available on the market, which is kind of key difference. And then lastly, we've got authorised representatives or authorised representative. This is a person or business appointed by the manufacturer to undertake specific tasks on their behalf. You don't necessarily have to have an authorised representative, but there are some rules and legislation about that. So just going to talk a little bit more about just making sure that you check the legal responsibilities that you might have as an economic operator under the kind of new regime. So the key change really is about distributors becoming importers because of the fact that we are now an external market to the EU. So there's quite a lot of detailed guidance on this online, but it's really important to consider whether the role of your importers, distributors and authorised representatives have changed in any way. So to talk a little bit about authorised representatives, of course, they can no longer be based in the EU for the GB market. And authorised representatives, of course, based in Great Britain are no longer going to be recognised by the European Union. But I think one of the really important changes really is if you were previously a distributor within a single market, you may now be an importer for the UK and vice versa. And as in the EU, of course, importers have more responsibilities than distributors. It's not on this slide, but I'm just going to quickly mention, of course, that the EU now have this new market surveillance regulation, which came into force on the 16th of July, which means you may need to appoint an EU representative if there's no other economic operator in place when exporting to the EU and Northern Ireland. So just a reminder of that. I'm just going to touch a little bit more on the responsibilities of importers. So importers have additional duties to ensure products are compliant with product standards. And these include things like, of course, showing their name and address on the product or documents, keeping a copy of the Declaration of Conformity, responding to requests from market surveillance authorities, and so on. Again, there are some transitional measures here too. So it's worth, if you think you are now an importer, reading the full guidance online. But essentially, until the end of 2022, you can place the importer's address on the product's accompanying documents. So that does make things easier. But of course, after that, it will need to be placed on the good itself. So we've been focusing up until now, of course, on the GB market. The final part of this presentation will cover placing manufactured goods on the Northern Ireland market from a regulatory perspective. So we won't be talking about customs, tariffs, or kind of other arrangements, but just focusing on the regulation. So goods will need to kind of continue to meet EU regulatory requirements to be placed on the market in Northern Ireland for as long as the Northern Ireland Protocol is in place. So as Northern Ireland continues to align with EU rules, this does mean that the CE marking continues to be the conformity marking for most new approach goods. So you will continue to use CE marking, of course, if you self-declare or if you use an EU notified body to carry out mandatory conformity assessment. So products which have had a mandatory conformity assessment done by a UK-based notified body will need to use the CE plus UKNI marking instead. And these products cannot be placed on the market in the 27 EU member state if they've been tested by a UK-based notified body. So the UKNI marking, of course, is the new conformity assessment marking for products placed on the market in Northern Ireland. You would never, as I said, you would never apply it on your own, so you do have to apply it with a CE marking, and it's really important to remember that. And again, it is only for those products that have undergone mandatory third-party conformity assessment by a body based anywhere in the UK. So we've just talked about rules which cover placing goods on the market in Northern Ireland. But of course, Northern Ireland is still part of the UK. And it's important to note that there is a separate regime for goods from Northern Ireland being placed on the market in the rest of the United Kingdom. And this will apply regardless of any difference that might emerge in the rules between Great Britain and the European Union. So qualifying Northern Ireland goods marked with a CE or CE plus UKCA can continue to be placed on the market in Great Britain under the government's commitment to Northern Ireland's unfettered access to the rest of the UK, even though this might not normally be allowed. So this is, of course, unfettered access is a central feature, of course, of the Northern Ireland Protocol, meaning that trade from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, which remains in the UK customs territory, should not be subject to tariffs, and protecting, of course, and other kind of barriers, and protecting Northern Ireland's place in the UK customs territory. So the definition of a qualifying Northern Ireland good is any good in which is in Northern Ireland, and not under customs control, and not taking advantage of any kind of special customs procedures. There's lots of guidance on this on gov.uk, and you're probably quite aware of this if you are in a position where you are moving goods between Northern Ireland and Great Britain already. But you can use gov.uk to check whether your goods will qualify for unfettered access to the GB market. So it does only apply to Northern Ireland. Irish businesses, for example, kind of need to follow kind of normal processes. So if you've got goods coming from Ireland, this would not apply to them. And of course, we do have strong anti-avoidance provisions set out in law that enable action to be taken when a business looks to reroute their goods via Northern Ireland to avoid kind of import formalities in Great Britain. And these arrangements, of course, are all already in place. So this is the final slide of the presentation. You may or may not be relieved to hear. But as with responsibilities for importers and distributors between Great Britain and the EU, there are, of course, also different responsibilities for those in Northern Ireland supply chain. So you do become an importer if you're bringing goods into Northern Ireland from Great Britain or another non-EU country and place them on the market in Northern Ireland for the first time. So again, that kind of comes with responsibilities that we've just been discussing. So making sure goods are labelled with your details and the correct conformity or assessment procedures have been carried out, amongst the other responsibilities which I kind of touched upon earlier. And yeah, again, if you're placing goods on the GB market from outside the UK, so if you're an importer if you're a Northern Ireland business placing goods from outside the UK on the Great British market. So again, you'd have those kind of importer responsibilities and need to make sure that your goods are kind of labelled appropriately. So that's everything I was kind of going to cover. And I just wanted to highlight, that we are in a process of updating our guidance for businesses. So some of the examples you saw earlier in the presentation are included in that update, but it's kind of a more comprehensive update across all these different areas. So prototypes, spare parts, leasing and hiring of goods, repair and refurbished products, existing stock and components within finished products. So we're still a few weeks away from making that update, but we're trying to do that as quickly as possible. And we hope that will help businesses make the preparations that they need. So final slide really is about kind of trying to encourage you to take action now if you haven't already. The key steps are kind of summarised in this slide. So of course, you can use the UKCA marking now, and if you haven't started to use it or you haven't started preparing to use it already, I hope this information that I presented to you today has been helpful, and that you will start making those preparations as soon as possible. The other key kind of message as well is kind of ensuring that economic operators and suppliers in your supply chain understand their responsibilities and their requirements, and this includes kind of talking to your international suppliers. As we are aware, there's kind of less knowledge about this kind of abroad. So we really appreciate your support in terms of speaking to those international partners and making sure that they too are making their preparations. So I will leave it there and hand you back to Fergus for now.
All right, thank you very much for that. I think particularly that message of using the time between now and the end of next year to make sure both we as manufacturing businesses in the UK are ready, but also working with our international partners and our suppliers overseas so that they understand their obligations, I think is essential. So delighted to be having this session today to run through that. As I said, there will be a Q&A session after the two presentations, and there's already been some lively action on the Q&A box, so thank you to those who put there, just as a forerunner, some questions around labelling both CE and UKCA and what the obligations are there, some questions on spare parts and on second-hand goods that Laura mentioned. There is additional guidance, but perhaps we can have a few thoughts on those in the Q&A. But right now, I'll hand you over to Chris, and Chris will run through some of the more specifics for our sector, but also some of the ways that Make UK can help companies. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Fergus. So hopefully you can all see my slides. There we go. Okay, fantastic. So yeah, thank you, Fergus. Thank you, Laura, for that first presentation. And my job here really is to be more specific about requirements for what we think is our audience. And I'm therefore going to be talking about machinery specifically. So one of the directives, one of the regulations that Laura touched on there is the machinery directive and regulations. That's what I'll be focusing on. I'll probably say that about 3 times throughout the presentation, but everything I'm talking about is specifically about machinery. Okay. So as Fergus said, my name is Chris Newson. I'm the head of health, safety and sustainability training for Make UK. Which might not appear to be a direct fit with this subject, but we have been inundated with questions and requirements to help people with this subject, particularly around training. So that's how I've come to be involved, I suppose, if you like. So I'm going to go through a few slides here. So first of all, as I said, I'm talking specifically and only about machinery. And it is important to just touch on something. I'm not going to read the long title out because it doesn't sound very interesting, but it is. And this is the supply of machinery regulations. Now, this has been around for a very long time. The latest issue of it is 2008. And so in itself, it hasn't changed. But when the UKCA and CE marking rules changed, that obviously then meant some changes. So this is what I'm going to talk about. If you're not familiar with it, and I'll just tell you what it's about. So it defines exactly what machinery is. It's extremely specific about what machinery is and isn't. And I won't go through that today, but if you have a question about whether what you make is machinery, then just read the first page of the regulation. There's a really good, clear definition there. So it defines what machinery is. And as Laura said, it requires the manufacturer or supplier to meet essential health and safety requirements. The emphasis there is to make sure that these products don't hurt people. That's the key thing. It also outlines conformity procedures that the manufacturer or supplier must follow. And that's very, very important for what we're talking about today. So I'll spend some time on that. And it also requires the production of things called a technical file, certificate of conformity, and the need to affix in some way a UKCA mark. So that's what the regulation says today. It used to say CE mark, so it now says UKCA mark. So you can see what the difference is there. So that is the regulation, and that's where we're going to sort of keep coming back to as we go through. So first of all, it's interesting for me and helps me put into context here where you're coming from as an audience. So you can see a poll on the screen. If you could just answer for us which one of those you fit into. Are you a supplier, a user, or both? And that'll help us to put things in the right context. So I'll give you about a minute or so just to put your answers in, and then we'll share the results. Okay, have we got some results there, Chris? Here we are. Right. Okay. Fantastic. So, interesting. Yeah. So, 32% of people are suppliers, and then roughly about half are only users. So what I want to say about that is that the main emphasis of today is for suppliers of machinery, but let's not fall into the trap of thinking because we're only users that none of this applies to us, because if you are a user of machinery, you will, or any equipment, you'll be familiar with something called the PURE regulations that put requirements on you and how you use equipment. And they tie very clearly back to the supply regulations. And you have a requirement to make sure that new equipment coming into your company that you're going to give to your employees to use follows the same rules that we're going to talk about today. So just because you're not a supplier, it doesn't mean this doesn't apply to you. It just applies in a different way. Okay, and unfortunately, if you've answered C both, then you've got to look at it from both sides of the argument as such. Okay, so thank you for that. So we're going to talk about the change from CE to UKCA, particularly from the point of machinery. So this is how things looked, I don't know, a short time ago, a month or so ago, perhaps before the extension was agreed. And if I can just sort of, so I won't spend too long on this because it isn't the case now, but some key points that are here. So we're probably all aware that from the 1st of January this year, we were making a transition from the UKCA, from the CE marking to the UKCA marking. But as Laura said, you know, actually, if you look behind the scenes, the essential safety requirements have not changed. You know, they are still the same. It's a question we get a lot. Well, you know, what do I have to meet now? What do I have to do differently? You don't have to do anything differently. The point is how you prove that you've done the right thing. That's what's different. In order to understand those essential safety requirements, there used to be something, and there still is something called EU harmonised standards. So as the title suggests, it's a list of standards that were agreed between all member states in the EU, and that's how we prove things were safe. Now, because changes have happened, as we know, we don't use those anymore. So in GB, we have things called GB designated standards, and in the rest of the EU, they have harmonised standards. What's really important to say here, and again, Laura said this, is that today there is no difference between GB designated standards and EU harmonised standards. The list, which I'll point you towards later on, is the same. So again, you know, we're perhaps thinking, okay, not that much to worry about just yet. So that's what you have to do. You have to meet the essential health and safety requirements, and you use these standards to prove that you've done that. Okay, the UKCA mark will not be recognised in the EU, as Laura said, which makes sense. And again, and I'll point out this was the previous position. So you may be able to continue to use CE marking in GB until the end of 2021. That's how things were a short time ago. And then also, just to finish this off, up until the 1st of January 23, you can show conformance via a certificate. So you don't have to put a permanently affixed label on. You can just, you do it by certificate, which I think answers a couple of questions that have been asked so far. So up until the 1st of January 23, you can mark just by doing it on the certificate rather than on the product itself. So that was the position, okay? From since the changes have been made and the extension has happened, that's the same. So we're aware that we are making a transition from CE marking to UKCA. This is the same. The essential health and safety requirements are the same, and we must now use GB designated standards if we're going to UKCA mark. The bit, sorry, this has changed. This has stayed the same as well. So the UKCA mark will not be recognised in the EU, which is sensible. This is the bit that's changed that makes a big difference. So you must use UKCA marking from the 1st of January 2023. So there's been an extension there that we've talked about so far. Until that point, you can use CE marking. So as everyone's sort of saying, we might sort of suggest we don't need to worry about it yet, but as we'll go on to explain here, that last point there, that we don't have to do it till January 23, is with quite, several caveats that we need to understand, particularly with machinery. So I'll outline what those are. So that is the current position after the extension's been put forward. Okay, so in order to understand what we've got to do, I think it's important to understand a little bit about the machinery regulations themselves. And I tell you why I think it's important, because a lot of the questions we get really are answered by understanding this regulation. So I'm talking here about the Supply of Machinery Safety Regulations 2008. Okay, so you can see on the slide that we've got here, this is a flow chart from guidance that goes along with that regulation. And it says, first of all, are we talking about machinery? So that's the first question. Understand that definition and work out whether what you make is machinery. If it is, then we stick with this flow chart. If it isn't, we need to look at another one of the regulations. So if we're looking at machinery, we must always provide a technical file and instructions. And people always ask us, well, what do you mean a technical file? Well, it's things like instructions, technical standards that have been used, the list of sort of whatever it might be, BEIS standard that's been used in the manufacture. So that's what the technical file is, and instructions, we understand what they are. In the machinery regulations, you are then asked a question: is your machine in something called Annex 4 or not? So Annex 4 is a list of machines that are considered to be higher risk than ones that are not in it, if you see what I mean. So it's not a very long list, there's a list, but it's really important, as I'll illustrate here. So if my machinery is not in Annex 4, then I go through, in order to show that I conform and to put a CE mark on, or UKCA mark, then I have to go through method 1. Now, people refer to method 1 as self-certification, and I think that tells you everything you need to know. You don't need to involve anyone else in that process. If your equipment is not in Annex 4, you can self-certify. And then, as I say, you don't need to involve anyone else in that process. If your machinery is in Annex 4, in other words, it's higher risk, then you can, and this, sorry, I should have said, this is currently the flow chart that's in the machinery directive, which is the same for the whole of Europe. This is sort of prior to us leaving the EU, if you like. So if our machine is higher risk in Annex 4, we can make it fully in line with harmonized standards. If we can prove we've made it fully in line with harmonized standards, then we can still go through method 1, which is to self-certify. If again, it's a dangerous machine, dangerous isn't the right word, higher risk machine, and we decide not to make it in line with harmonized standards, because we don't have to, that's a voluntary thing. If we don't make it in line with harmonized standards, then we have to go through method 2 or 3. Method 2 is where you use an external body to basically do the marking for you. And you have to do that in that case. Method 3 is where you use an external body to come in and certify your company, your business, to CE mark going forward. So I've said quite a lot of things there. Just to summarize, if your machinery is not in Annex 4, it's not in this higher risk bracket, you can just do marking yourself. If it is in this higher risk bracket, if you follow the harmonized standards, you can still do marking yourself. If you don't, then you go through, you have to use a third party. Again, this is just for machinery. So that is how things were for the whole of Europe, and that remains the process for the EU at the minute. Of course, we're not in the EU, so that is the process for the EU. The process for us is very, very similar, and we've substituted harmonized standards for GB designated standards, basically. So let me show you what that looks like, and then I'll come back to a couple of points here. So it's exactly the same. The flow chart's exactly the same, but instead of EU harmonized standards, it says GB designated standards. So if my machinery is in this high risk bracket, if I make it in line, fully in line with GB harmonized standards, I can then self-certify, self-declare, and don't need to involve a third party. If I don't want to make it fully in line with standards, then I have to go through one of these other routes which require me to involve a third party. And so hopefully you can see a lot of the time, particularly with machinery, let's say that again, then self-certification is absolutely an option. It might not be what you do today, but it might be worth considering that that's the route you want to go. So that's, I know there's a lot there, but that's important to understand that before we sort of carry on and say anything else. Now, just to finish this off, this is a question we get very often, and it's popped up in the chat 2 or 3 times today. So I'm talking here about machinery. So finished machinery, it's a finished product, okay. If we've got something the regulations call partly completed machinery, so it's a part of a bigger assembly, you know, it's not a finished product, it's something like a motor, for example, which is then going to go into a finished piece of machinery, then the process is much simpler. So we have to provide relevant technical documentation, so assembly instructions, technical specs for this piece of equipment, and then we complete a declaration of incorporation. And the reason it's called that is because it then allows the end assembler as such to incorporate it with lots of other bits of machinery and make a finished product. Now you'll see in this line here, there's no requirement there to mark whether it's CE marking or UKCA. So the main point there is that if you make a part that is an assembly that goes into a bigger assembly later on in its life, you're just providing parts, if you like, then you don't need to CE mark. And we get asked that question quite a lot. There is a caveat. I'm talking here about machinery. There are many different directives. You may have to CE mark because you make an electrical assembly and it's part of the electrical directive. So the point there is to check which directives you are marking under and whether you actually have to CE or even UKCA mark at all. But for partly completed machinery, you don't have to do that. Okay, so that's just the background to the process, which helps us then to understand what we have to do, hopefully. So that's the UKCA process. That's the process today. Okay, now I've mentioned here, this is good news here, I've mentioned here a couple of times something called GB designated standards. So what they are about is a list of standards that we can follow. So very similar to the harmonized standards previously, but they are called GB designated standards. Now, I'm trying to be a bit too clever here and share the link for this with you in the chat. I'll do that as soon as I finish talking. I can't do 2 things at once. So I'll share the link for this file with you. It's from, it's on the UK government website. You can find it very easily, but I'll share it for you. And what this tells us is, first of all, it's searchable. So if you think about the standards that you use today, or you've used in the past, the EU harmonized standards, you can look up those standards by their standard number here in this list. And if they are GB designated standards, they'll be on here. If they are, then you don't really need to change much about your process because you're marking it to the same standard. You now need to put a UKCA mark rather than a CE mark. And as we stand today, and as Laura said already, both lists are the same at the moment. So the UK, the GB designated standards and the EU harmonized standards it's the same list. Now, at some point in the future, they could diversify. There's no plans to do that at all, but it's worth just keeping your eye on that. Now, if they remain the same, then there's very little in your process that you have to change. So that is GB designated standards. So all, potentially good news so far. However, there's a couple of things that I think are important to make people aware of. So, and I've been perhaps a little bit over dramatic here calling it a warning, but What this is about is CE marking is only valid in Great Britain for areas where GB and EU rules remain the same. So if the EU changes the rules and you CE mark your product on the basis of those new rules, then you'll not be able to CE mark going forward. So we know that we have to change, and that's been put back a year basically, but that we only get that sort of delay there if the UK, if the GB harmonised standards and the EU harmonised standards remain the same. There's no plans for them to change. I'm just saying if they do change, then we can no longer carry on CE marking, even if that's before the end of 2022. So, for example, as I was just saying there, the UK and the EU standards, GB and EU standards diverge. For some reason, they go different ways. And we manufacture to the old EU standard, then we can't carry on doing that. It's extremely unlikely because there's no reason why the standards should diverge. But if the standard you're using to prove conformance changes, then you will need to go to the UKCA mark quicker than the 31st of December 22. Okay, so that's one reason you might have to do it sooner. The other, again, warning, I suppose, is you only need to use the new UKCA marking before the 1st of January 2023 if the following apply, if all of the following apply. So it's not an or, it's everything here. So let's just look at this list. So is your product, it is for the market in GB. So if it's that, if it's covered by legislation which requires UKCA marking, so the machinery regulations that we looked at just now require UKCA marking. We've just been given an extra year to make that transition, but they do require UKCA marking. Do they require mandatory third-party conformity assessment? So if we're talking about machinery, if it's in the Annex 4 that I mentioned earlier on, if we make it in line with fully harmonised standards, they don't require third-party conformity assessment. But if we decide to not make it in line with standards for some reason, then we have to get a third party to look at it. That's mandatory. It's not a choice we can make. That has to happen. So that's, so we're saying we have to UKCA mark before the 1st of January if all of these things are true. And the conformity assessment has been carried out by a UK conformity body. So, and there's a lot of things there. So I've just tried to summarise where it might apply. So if you make equipment for use in hazardous atmospheres, so the hazardous atmospheres regulations and European directive have a mandatory requirement for third-party conformity assessment. So if you make machinery for use in hazardous atmospheres, you have to go through this conformity assessment, then you will need to start using UKCA marking now. So it depends exactly what you're making. It's not as easy as just saying, we don't need to worry about it until January 23. That's true in most cases, but I'm just pointing out there's a couple of caveats to that. Okay, so just another poll question to help us then before we go on to the final few bits here. So the poll is 4 answers. Do you supply into just GB, GB and NI, GB, NI and EU, or just EU? So I'll give you a minute or so to answer that, and then we'll see what we get. Okay, have we got some results there? Okay, right. So, that's perhaps not surprising that people on the call today, overwhelming majority, 80% supplying to GB, NI and EU. And, I think that is, that shows that that's common, okay, but that's the issue because you might need to have, 3 different procedures about what you do on the face of it. In reality, what we're just saying, in the previous couple of slides is that the process is very similar. The standards you use are the same unless they diverge. Okay, there's a caveat, but everything is, the standards are the same. It's the marking bit at the end that has changed. So you need to have a process that caters for that. And again, I think a couple of people have asked on the chat, can I dual mark? You know, can I have one certificate of conformity that's got UKCA and CE on it? The answer to that today is yes. There's more details if you want to get into the how long will that last in the guidance, but the answer to that today is yes. So especially if you've answered C to that, which is 80% of the people, you need to just think about those different routes and make sure you've got the right procedures in for them. That's all sort of obvious thing to say, really, but that's the key. Okay, so that was that. And just a couple of last things then. I thought this would be useful. It doesn't look like it's useful because it looks like a very busy slide, but let me just show you a couple of things here. So I said at the very beginning, we've got to ask ourselves the question, first of all, is my thing that I'm making machinery? If it's not machinery, and it's a very specific definition in this regulation, so you can have a look at it. If it's not machinery, then I need to look at a different regulation, and the rules are very similar, but will be, there will be caveats and slight differences. So you need to make sure you're looking at the right thing for your products. If I'm talking about machinery, so I've answered yes to that question. Next question, am I supplying into the EU and NI only? So not many people on this call, but if I'm doing that, next question, do I need to use an assessment? So if I've answered yes, do I need to use an assessment body? So think about that flow chart that's there. That clearly tells me whether I have to use an assessment body or not. And you might be using an assessment body today, but that's not the question. It's, do you have to use an assessment body? So worth answering that question. If I'm not using an assessment body, nothing changes and I can continue to CE mark. Okay. If I am using an assessment body, are they an EU body or an EU registered body? And as Laura already said, I can't supply into the EU and CE mark using a body that's not an EU body. I can't use a UK, a GB body to certify to then go into the EU. So that's a question. If they're not an EU body, they've got to be, so I've got to get an EU body if I'm going to continue to supply into the EU. Okay, going back to this, am I supplying into the in EU or NI only? So let's say I'm not. So I'm supplying into all three or even just GB. So do I use method 1 self-certification for my machinery? So if the answer to that's yes, I can continue to do that until January 2023. So I don't need to change anything today if the answer to that question is yes. Okay, if it's not method 1 and I have to use an external body to my company, if I have to do that, have I transferred to an EU recognised body? If the answer to that's yes, I can continue to CE mark. Okay. If I haven't transferred to an EU recognised body, the answer over here is no, then I must use UKCA marking. So I must start to do that. But not as difficult as it sounds, I don't think. These things are always more difficult in practice, but if you look at this, do I use the UKCA mark for supply? Sorry, I must use that mark for supply from the 1st of January. So are the standards you're using for conformity assessment recognised in Great Britain? So are they GB designated standards? And there's a list we can check, I mentioned before. So if the answer to that is yes, continue as before, but now we're UKCA marking, we use a different mark, we can use the same certificate, we can dual certify if we're using GB designated standards, which will be 99% of the time because they're the same at the moment. If I look at that list and I'm not using GB designated standards, then I have to use standards that are recognised in Great Britain. And if I do that, then I can continue and use UKCA marking. So again, lots of things on there, and you get access to this recording and the slides afterwards if you want to look at it in more detail. But there's a lot of questions for you to answer to then find out actually what you have to do. It's not as simple as just saying, you know, you don't have to do this till 23, or you do have to do this as from tomorrow. It depends what you make and how you make it. So that flowchart there is designed to help you in that process. Okay, so final bit from me then is sort of the same as that, really. We have a Q&A session now, and I'm sure we've got lots of questions. If after the webinar you go back and reflect on some things and want some further specific answers to queries or specific advice, you can email us. We'll put some contact details up after this, but you've also got an address there which goes straight through to our team of EHS consultants that deal with these sort of things all the time. We also have a range of consultancy services, so we can visit your site and help you to work out the right thing to do if that can't be answered just in a quick conversation. And then the final thing, if you want to upskill the rest of your workforce in this subject, then we've developed, because there's been a demand for it over the last sort of 12 months, we've developed a half-day awareness program that goes into what CE and UKCA marking is all about and what the world looks like as of today. So a couple of different things we can help you with there. So the final poll here, and this will just help us to collect some information to sort of point our services in the right direction, I think. And also sort of see the feeling of the audience and where you are with things. So 3 questions there. Does everyone that needs to understand the new UKCA requirements in your organisation? So does everyone that needs to, not everyone, everyone that needs to understand what we're talking about here today in your organisation? Does your supply chain understand all the new requirements? And the 3rd question is, do you require help and support in marking products and creating the correct paperwork? So, you know, just let us know if that's the case, because that's the point, you know, we are here to help you. Okay, so that's all I have to say. I'm going to pass back to Fergus now, if that's okay, Fergus.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I think we've still got that poll running in the background. We'll leave that running for the moment and just go into the Q&A session. I think thanks to our colleagues from BEIS who have been working in the background answering a number of the questions in writing to those which were submitted to the Q&A. But perhaps we could pick up, Laura, some of the common themes which are coming through the questions. I think particularly one of the questions about marking products either physically or with a associated paperwork, and just understanding where the deadline sits for that. So the physical marking of a product, does that have to take place by the end of next year? And if not, how do you prove conformity? And one addendum to that question, which is quite common, is multiple marking of products. So can you put both a UKCA and a CE mark and a UKNI mark on products? What are the obligations on manufacturers? Laura, over to you.
Thanks, Fergus. So you've got until the end of 2023 until you have to physically apply the marking to your product unless the legislation states otherwise. So you can do that either via a sticky label or on an accompanying document. Have to have the UKCA marking on that. You can dual mark as long as both markings are clear and legible and your product meets the rules for both markets, which, as we've covered, I think, quite extensively. Yeah, the essential requirements are the same at the moment, so that's absolutely fine. With the UKNI marking, of course, that must be applied alongside the CE marking. You cannot place goods with a CE plus UKNI marking on the EU market. That is not acceptable. You can only place goods, of course, with CE marking on the EU market. So if you had something that was UKNI plus CE marked, you wouldn't be able to place it on the EU market, but you can place it on the market in Northern Ireland, and of course it qualifies on the market in Great Britain. Does that help, Fergus, or is there more to that question?
Oh, I think that comes through. So Just to work through an example, I have a product which I'm going to place on the market. I'm not sure whether that product is going to end up through my distribution chain in the market in GB or in the EU after next year. Can I have both marks on that product for both the EU market and for the UK market?
So yeah, absolutely. As long as both are marked very clearly, then that's absolutely fine.
That's great. Thanks very much for that, Laura. Another question which is coming through quite clearly is around the obligations of the definitions of importer, distributor, and manufacturer. Just going through that and understanding where the obligation lies, is it possible for the manufacturer to insist on an importer or distributor being responsible for the labeling of the product and the marking of a product for UKCA if that manufacturer is outside of the UK market? Perhaps you can talk a little about some of the obligations for manufacturers, for importers and distributors. Thanks very much.
Ben, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, of course. So in terms of marking products and performing compliance functions on behalf of the manufacturer, you can appoint an authorised representative under the legislation to do that for you. So it is entirely possible. It's worth checking the legislation on your product just to check what the position is regarding third-party conformity assessment. You know, depending on what module you pick, that will affect the process that you need to follow. But the distinction between the two really is, you know, the importer is just somebody who is placing a good from outside the UK on the market for the first time, and an authorised representative isn't somebody who is placing goods on the market. They're performing compliance functions on behalf of the manufacturer. And of course, in practice, you know, a natural legal person can be performing both responsibilities at the same time. But the way the legislation works is, you know, the manufacturer doesn't necessarily appoint an importer, for example. If somebody is bringing a good from outside the UK and placing it on the market, the legislation is triggered and they are by default the importer for that good, and they have to comply with all the obligations under the legislation.
Thanks very much for that, Ben. Another common theme which is coming through the questions is in terms of second-hand equipment. So one question being, does second-hand equipment sold as second-hand have to have a UKCA if it had a CE mark when it was new, when it is sold in GB after the end of next year? Laura, perhaps you.
I'm actually going to about one again to Ben, I think. Oh,
you're on mute. You're on mute.
Ben is struggling, I think, maybe with his. He's looking very confused. Oh, there he is. Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. So the situation with second-hand goods is if they are placed on the GB market before the 31st of December 2022, they don't need to be remarked with UKCA after that date, essentially. They only need to be UKCA marked and placed on the market for the first time. So if it's a good that's on, let's say, the EU market, or let's say it's on the market in the US, for example, if it's being placed on the UK market, well, GB market, for the first time after the 31st of December 2022, it would need to be UKCA marked.
Thanks very much for that, Ben. Further to that, looking at refurbished products. So if the product is in a container and it gets returned, cleaned and refilled, supporting the objections of the circular economy, does the manufacturer have to keep a relevant date when the original container was first placed on the market? And will that container need to be UKCA marked after the end of next year?
So I'm happy to take this one. In terms of proof of placing on the market, to demonstrate that it was placed on the market when CE is acceptable, you would need to have to hand any sort of commercial document, so an invoice, contract, that sort of thing. It would only need to be remarked if it has undergone new conformity assessment or its fundamental purpose has been substantially changed or it's been modified. So if it's been, the fact that it physically moves somewhere else to be refurbished isn't necessarily an issue. If it's made up of lots of different parts which require individual marking, if a part which requires individual marking is replaced, that individual part will be placed on the GB market for the first time when it comes, at that point essentially. So if that happens after 31st December 2022, it would make sense that some remarking would need to take place. But if we're not actually talking about the changing of parts which individually require marking under the legislation, which is not commonly the case across the board, by the way, but if we are not talking about that situation and it's just simply refurbished, it wouldn't need to be remarked when being returned to the end user in GB.
Thank you very much for that, Ben. We've also had questions, perhaps Chris, you can pick this one up, Chris Newson, that is, on the declarations of conformity and whether you can combine those those declarations of conformity for both UKCA and CE marking, as long as you are making relevant references to the appropriate pieces of legislation. Chris, perhaps you could pick that up.
Yeah, so as we stand today, you can use the same document to both UKCA mark and CE mark. So yes, absolutely, you can do that. And as of today, the standards are the same. So that is, feasible, possible, helpful. But if the standards in future diverge, then that doesn't become, it becomes very difficult to do, because you're saying, well, it's CE marked for these standards, but then UKCA marked for these. But the simple answer to the question is, as of today, yes, you can dual certify on one piece of paper.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. We also have a question regarding notified bodies and looking at a notified body. The question is that my product requires testing by a notified body. I will still be able to use the CE mark until the extended 2023 deadline. Is that possible where the product has been tested by a UK notified body? The question here is, can a UK notified body certify against CE mark for the GB market? Perhaps we can go to our colleagues from BEIS.
So, sorry. Well, okay. So if you can no longer use UK, well, they're now called approved bodies to test for the CE marking. So anything that needs to be tested for CE marking must be tested by an EU notified body. And from the 1st of January 2021, UK notified bodies are now approved bodies, and they do not have they're no longer able to test for CE marking, is the essential answer there. Thank
you very much. And I think that there have been a number of questions looking at that specific issue around the requirements, particularly when products require conformity assessment and the obligations on the EU as well as the UK market. I think it's important to highlight here that since the beginning of this year, if you are placing goods on the EU market and they require conformity assessment, that has to be carried out by a body in the EU. If you are continuing to look at those obligations, I think there was a question in the Q&A which talked about supplying products to Ireland and having a CE mark on that product, and whether the deadline also extends to CE marking. There is no easement in terms of the EU market. If you are selling to an EU country, you will have to meet all of the obligations of the relevant CE marking legislation for the products that you put on that market. And that has been the case since the beginning of this year. So it is worth companies reviewing their obligations to understand perhaps whether their status has changed and whether they need to work with any certified bodies to ensure that their products are compliant on the EU market. Looking at some of the further questions, more specifically looking at the UKCA mark, perhaps colleagues from BEIS can address this one. Is there a website or guidance available where we can check products which we manufacture and whether they will need a UKCA mark? Laura.
Thanks. Yes, so we've got guidance from gov.uk. So the key two pieces for the UKCA marking are placing manufactured goods on the GB market and using the UKCA marking. It's just gov.uk/UKCA will take you onto the kind of main UKCA page. I'll have to post a link in the chat if that would be helpful.
That's great. Thank you very much. And another question here for non-UK based manufacturers. So for machinery, we use equipment manufactured in Germany. For the EU manufacturers selling to the UK, do they need the UKCA marking, or can they continue to use the CE mark for UK customers? Just to follow on from that question, we also had the example where a non-UK manufacturer was supplying several companies in the UK. They all are importers of that. Do they all have to meet the obligations of the importer? Can one organisation act on behalf of the manufacturer for the UK market? Colleagues from BEIS, perhaps.
Ben, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so the way the legislation works, if you, in the case of imported, you know, the reading of it is that anyone who is importing is an importer and needs to meet those obligations. In terms of authorised representatives, you can have an authorised representative to cover the entire market. I think in practice, I know that on the EU side, lots of companies do appoint an EU importer for the entire market to perform all those functions for them. So I think what you know, the commercial, it seems pragmatic that the commercial solutions that are adopted for the, you know, the EU market, because the rules technically are the same, are worth exploring for the UK market in that respect.
Thank you very much. Just looking at other questions and perhaps falling more into the scope of future planning and operations for further cooperation. Are there plans to look at putting in place mutual recognition agreements with laboratories or testing authorities in the EU and the UK? Perhaps a question for colleagues from BEIS on where those discussions are at the moment. And a further question about understanding diverging regulation, of what plans are in place to monitor and provide indications when standards or regulatory standards, I should say, diverge between the GB market and the EU market.
So in terms of kind of mutual recognition, I mean, we kind of did, I think that came up on it, obviously discussions in negotiations, and that's not something that the EU particularly wanted, so that's not something that's currently in place. I think as far as we're currently aware, they have no desire to reopen those discussions, although of course we are meeting with them regularly under kind of the various kind of technical committees under the TCA, but that is not something that I would expect to come into place. So I wouldn't encourage me to kind of rely on that happening. It's extremely unlikely, I would say. In terms of kind of, well, divergence, I mean, from the UK perspective, we've got no plans at the moment to diverge from EU rules. We don't want to do that just for the sake of it. So from our perspective, things are not going to change kind of in the foreseeable future. I know that, Chris, you had that very big warning slide in your presentation about divergence, but I think we're not really expecting that to be an issue during the kind of extended period where you can continue to place CE marked goods on the GB market.
Thank you very much for that. Looking at one final question before we wrap up at the top of the hour, and just to mention to those on the call, We have taken a recording of this session, which we'll supply to those who've attended and share the presentations from the call as well. In addition to the email address which Chris shared, we also have brexit@makeuk.org, where you can pass any questions to us, and we'll pass it on to Chris and his team if relevant. Chris, looking at the issue around in-house supply of machinery, so a couple of questions they're looking at. Do we still have the obligation to CE mark, or sorry, UKCA mark equipment which we produce and manufacture in-house for in-house use?
Yeah, that's I was going to say unfortunately, but it's a very straightforward question to answer. There is still a requirement to UKCA mark equipment that you are just going to use yourself if it is machinery. Using it yourself is within the definition of putting onto the market, and it doesn't matter whether it's, you know, obviously you're not going to charge yourself. It doesn't matter whether it's free of charge or whatever it might be. So the very simple answer to that is yes.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. Leaves me the opportunity to thank Chris, Laura, Ben, and Chris for joining us today and for taking us through the presentations and taking the time to run through those questions. We'll endeavour where we can to get back to people directly if there are any further questions which have remained unanswered through this session. And as I said, we will share a recording of this presentation, this webinar, and the presentations with everyone who has attended. As Chris has highlighted, we have a number of support services which we can offer companies in helping them understand their obligations and working through with you how you become compliant for both the GB markets, the NI markets, and the EU market. So please do feel free to contact us and we will endeavour to assist you as we can. Final thank you to everyone who's joined us and thank you very much for a very lively question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.